Okay. Okay. And I recognize every single person on this call, I think. That's fascinating. Okay, well, welcome, folks. Let's get going with this meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. As always, we are in Zoom here, in a Zoom meeting, which means we're all together. Whether you are a member of the council or observing our meeting or a member of a working group or a subcommittee, excuse me. So thanks for all joining us. Our sort of general Zoom protocol is we try to have Zoom members, Climate Council members, if you're able, keep your camera on as a way of sort of being present. And if you are observing our meeting today, not as a council member, we ask if you could kindly keep your camera off until public comment. Or if you are someone who's joining us for a particular section, obviously, we would love to have your camera on. We ask for the same for the chat. If you're a council member, feel free to use the chat. If you aren't, if you're observing, we ask that you hold off on the chat until the public comment period. And that's just sort of a nature of Zoom and how we're trying to run these things. All right, let me turn you over to your chair, Secretary Clauser, to kick us off. Secretary Clauser, please.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. As a preliminary matter, I just want to make sure I received a change of schedule for this meeting moments before the meeting started. So I just wanted to have Jane maybe check on that. On my calendar, it was moved from 12 to 3, and it said it was from the organizer. It may just be my issue, but I just wanted to flag it so folks look into it before we jump in.
Yeah, I didn't send that. So
okay.
I'm not sure. Did other people get that? No. Okay.
Perfect. Okay.
Maybe it thinks you're moving to California or something.
That's right. Or maybe like it just didn't want me to attend the meeting on time. Okay, so given that, I'll just quickly run through the agenda for folks. We'll start, as always, with review of last month's meeting, the minutes for January 24th. We'll move into a just transition and public engagement discussion, where the three-pronged draft approach for public engagement for 2022 will be reviewed. That will be followed by a subcommittee updates to the council, and then a break at 12:20. At 12:30, Jane will talk to us about the budgeting updates, remaining technical analyses. Remaining technical analyses that are due and potential budgeting for that process next year. At 1:30, Jane will walk us through bills that are in the legislature related to the CAP. That will be followed by a review of the draft 2022 work plan and dates for next meetings. And then we'll conclude, as always, with public comment.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Any questions about the agenda that Secretary Clauser just laid out? Any recommendations to adjust it or concerns about it? Great. Okay. So I think it's worth just repeating for folks who are jumping on right now that we have a couple folks standing in for their respective secretaries. We have maybe Jane, if you could just walk us through that list one more time for folks who are just joining.
Yeah, thank you. Andrea Wright is joining us on behalf of Secretary Flynn. Ryan Patch is joining on behalf of Secretary Tebbetts, and Bronwyn Cook is joining us on behalf of Secretary Curley. So they'll be acting as official council members today and participate in the conversation.
Super, excellent, and welcome to all three of you. Thanks for joining us. Okay, great. So let's just talk a moment about the minutes. I noticed some email traffic right before we got online where Jared picked up a couple typos or something in the minutes. And I think, Maren, you already even changed those. I just want to flag that happened in the last 40 minutes or so. Any other quick reactions or reactions to the minutes prior to you all just approving them? Any concerns? Anybody need a little more time with them? Okay. All right, not hearing requests for more time or concerns. Let's treat those as approved by you all. That's great. Okay, so the first substantive conversation we want to have, as Secretary Clauser said, is around just transitions and the public engagement effort that's related to that. And there's a couple ways we want to walk into this. I'm just making sure Kelly's here. Yeah, Kelly's here. Kelly's going to help us do this conversation. And before we do that, I just want to check with Jane. Is there something you'd like to tee up prior to having Kelly walk through what's going on in this task group that's working on public engagement under the context of just transition?
Great. Well, both Abby Willard is the new co-chair of the Just Transition Subcommittee. She took over for Sarah Phillips, and she works at the Ag Agency. Both her and Sue Mittner are not able to join us today. But as we put forward the public engagement task group, we were really thinking thoughtfully about the counselor representation on that group to be sure that there would always be a counselor who could convey the work of that up to all of you for conversation and thought. And so we've had the benefit of Kelly joining us on that task group, and Kelly's going to walk us through the components of public engagement that has been shared with you both as a minimalist slide show that Marion can put up for Kelly in a minute, as well as the longer document that outlines both what the climate action plan calls for in the space of public engagement, the conversation that you all had as a council back in December about what you thought the next phase of public engagement should look like, and then the approach that A&R is helping to support on behalf of the council with the public engagement task group that Kelly will walk through with all of you, and I'll happily fill in anything that Kelly might miss or add any details or questions that are needed. But it's great that Kelly's going to take you through it today.
Great. So Kelly, why don't you walk us through what this task group is up to and the work that's happening, and feel free to ask Marion to pull up those two brief slides when you need them.
Sure. Yes. I think you could probably pull them up now, Marion, if you'd like. So this task group has been meeting pretty regularly, about once a week for several weeks now. And we're working on how to do public engagement going forward. So there are some areas where the Agency of Natural Resources is providing some support, which is wonderful. So the biggest first bucket there is plan accessibility. And this is, A&R is helping us with making sure that things are in translation. So there's going to be a notice about the climate action plan translated into the 12 most commonly spoken languages in Vermont, just to make sure people are aware it's out there and it can be translated in its entirety if you need it. Translating the entire plan into all of those languages would be a monumental effort. So hopefully people take us up on it, but that's why that's being done that way. And the other part, and I'm pretty excited about this too, is developing a video that will be in multiple languages. So that's even more accessible for folks who maybe are not literate or just prefer to get information visually and auditorially. So that will be put out in multiple different languages to also let people know about the plan and the ability to get it translated. And then there are also going to be some templates reviewed to figure out how to format the plan in a way that's really digestible. And a project is underway to make the content of the plan in a much more engaging format using story maps. So I would encourage you to check out the longer document that's linked today that has more of the details, because there's some really cool examples of what that looks like, and it's easier for you to look at them than for me to explain them. But it's a really engaging way to try to help people understand what the plan is and what it's about, and bring some the goal would be to bring in some stories from real people about their experiences and things like that about plan and climate change and all of that. So that's the plan accessibility section. And then when it comes to the broad public engagement, CBI is going to be able to help us out, which we're also very excited about, to support some online events that will be to discuss with the Vermonters what's in the plan, and also really focus on the things that we're currently working on developing further, such as the biomass question, the transportation needs, especially now that the TCIP has fallen apart, we're having to recraft that. So that's a great opportunity for public engagement, and making sure people know what the next steps are in the plan and where we're going forward. The timing of those will be dependent on hopefully having a little bit more concrete information about where things are going with the legislature, but also not waiting so long that the initial excitement about the plan coming out and all of that has died away. So stay tuned. The last section, and this is what the task group itself has really been focused on, is targeted engagement through partner organizations. And this is something where we want to build a long relationship and a long-term relationship with some key partner organizations that reach some of the different, you can scroll on. So we're looking at hopefully 3 to 5 partner organizations that will reach various different parts of our Vermont population, especially those who might be most in need of having their voices heard, being lifted up. And the goal is not to educate folks on the plan initially, or even to hear people's feedback on the plan, but really to start that dialogue and conversation and listening to folks about what their overall experiences have been, trying to learn from people and meet people where they are. And the approach with each of these groups is going to be different based on the different nature of these groups. So trying to really meet people where they are, lift them up, and be laying the groundwork for a longer term partnership. And then the hope is that by focusing on a few, we don't have the capacity to reach every single person, but by focusing on a few, we can start to get an idea of how we could use a similar technique of outreach to continue to reach more and more and more people, and hopefully reach all Vermonters and hear people's stories and make sure that this is as just a transition as possible. So CBI, Consensus Building Institute, is also going to be helping us with this part as well. And David has been sitting in on our and facilitating all of our task force meetings. So David, Marion, Jane, anything that I missed?
Sounds great, Kelly. I think that was a great overview. And I think that distinction is so important about sort of the broad-based engagement through some sort of online meetings, and then really what Kelly's talking about now, which has a longer term focus of exactly as some of you all really stressed back in December, of working through trusted partners and organizations and really investing in the future of credible conversation with different Vermonters around issues that are of relevance to this council, right? Climate action, whether that's how we heat our homes, how we move around, all these issues, how we're prepared for different kinds of natural and other disasters. That's trying to build that up so that, as Kelly says, it's an investment in the future, so that you have credible lines of engagement that work over time. Okay. So I think unless Marion, Jane, or others who've been deeply involved in this work want to supplement. And Chris Campany, because you're a member of the Just Transitions, you've been looking at this as well. So please feel free to jump in as you need.
I think Kelly captured it well. Just one of the things I think we're going to need to have a broader conversation about is, dynamics on the world stage are really going to change the dynamics around energy, both in terms of oil and gas costs now, propane, everything else, plus in the world of grains, especially oil grains, one of the biggest producers in the world is just taken offline. And so that's going to have implications for replacement fuel. So I think we just need to acknowledge that there are some major global changes afoot right now, aside from all the other, all the other issues associated with the war that are going to affect people's pocketbooks and their receptivity to hear about what the climate action plan might include. So we might want to consider how to frame actions in the plan. Frankly, in my personal opinion, it underscores the need to move quickly towards a non-hydrocarbon future. Certainly Western Europe has gotten that point now, so it's not just us, but we need to figure out, I think, how to kind of frame the discussions in a way that that are going to be productive and kind of represent the reality of the now versus the reality of when the plan was first approved.
Thanks, Chris. Great.
David, I would just say that thank you very much to Kelly for that great overview. I thought that since it's mindful of our conversation later on the agenda around capacity and contractual work and analyses, I just sort of wanted to frame this as the this plan, this public engagement strategy is the capacity that we currently have both through our contractual capacity as well as our staff capacity and A&R to support public engagement. So I just wanted to say that as we brainstorm or use this conversation to consider what might be missing here from what the council would like to see, there's no added capacity from where I sit to support additional work in this space.
Okay. All right. So council members, any questions you have for those of you who have been working on this conversation, thoughts, reactions, feedback that Kelly and others should carry back to this task group and Just Transitions Subcommittee? Anything you want to say about this work? How is it matching what you said you wanted to have happen in December? Bram?
So I'd just say thank you to the group. I think this is a really good start. I mean, we'd like to engage all 600,000 Vermonters, but we know we're not going to do that. So I think building the plan that gets us as far as possible, as well as possible, is the step we can take, and it looks like we've done that. I think setting the goal of co-creation, like, that's a pretty high bar, and I think whether we get all the way there or not, we have to try. And so thank you for this really big step forward.
Thanks, Bram. Thanks. Other reactions? Okay. Does this feel like it's going the right direction? Yeah. Okay. All right. Julie Jane Marion.
I can't take that seriously. So one other comment I would just ask is that I know there's conversation in a number of the task groups around public engagement needs, and just wanted to draw that out from council members who are participating in those to just highlight the conversations that you're all having about other capacity to support the ongoing work of those task groups, and just highlight highlight the thoughts there and make sure that now would be a good time to just sort of bring that up at the council level, at the work that's happening, to think about public engagement needs for task groups.
Why don't we talk about that for a second? Because I've heard to the grapevine that there's interest in doing specific outreach around transportation, for instance, and the work that's being done there. I'm not quite sure how the biomass conversation will go forward. I wonder if we do want to talk about that just for a second, about how we maybe use this structure we're setting up as a pathway to do that. I don't know those who have been involved. I see, Joey, you're here, or others that are involved in the transportation conversations. Is there something to work on right now about how the outreach needs for that topical work get addressed and what's being put forward here?
Well, I would say the transportation task group, we met last week, and we're going to meet again this week to really clarify process. And the public engagement component didn't get as much time as it needs to explore. So we're going to dig in more deeply on that on Wednesday. And I think there absolutely is a need and an opportunity to coordinate these efforts. What exactly that looks like is unclear to me at this point, although, in our sort of process, our recommended process for the transportation work, we did identify sort of a level set webinar that we'd want to hold. I think we were maybe being a little ambitious with the capacity we have. We noted late February or mid-March. That's going to be pushed out a little bit, obviously. But I think that's one of the sort of most timely and concrete things that we have on our agenda. And Kelly, I'd welcome the conversation with you and other members of Just Transition around how, we can sort of partner on that / promote. And then just stepping back more broadly, how this fits into the public engagement process that is being lifted by the full council, I think would be a bigger question. So anyway, short-term need, and then longer-term need as we build out the gap filling needed in the transportation space related to the plan. If others have more specific thoughts on like concrete measures, I'm sort of grappling with in general, and I know Jane's been clear about limited capacity, but I mean, the transportation sector being 40%, I feel like, just grappling with how we're gonna undertake this work with the time capacity that we have to do it is a bigger question for me. But I just want to say, thanks to Just Transition for the work you did, and thanks to the state team for putting together some resources to help support the capacity we're going to need to help do it. But we don't have the clarity we need to answer that question. I think I don't, at least to the degree you may be asking it, David, but if others have thoughts, I certainly would welcome them.
Sure. Any other reactions to this? Kelly?
So one thing that I've wanted for a long time, and I probably mentioned this in the task group at some point, and rightly was told we don't really have capacity, but on the wish list, which might not be a huge lift, would be sort of a DIY kit of, a lot of us are members of different organizations. We might want to host our own educational webinars or something like that, but having sort of a kit where we can have our, an outline of how you could communicate about the plan, how you can engage people better, and letting us go out to our own organizations or folks that we're connected to and facilitate those things without needing to have CBI involved or ANR or anything like that.
Yeah. Thanks, Kelly. Jane, Julie, Marion?
So I would just like Kelly, I put together kind of a background presentation. I think it is out on the Climate Council website, but maybe either Marion can drop it into the chat, a link to it, or we can send it around in an editable format, but it's intended to do that. It's really just sort of a fairly high level overview of the climate action plan. It's what we've been using as we've been called into different legislative committees just to provide background. But I think probably would be an excellent foundation for the sort of presentation you're referring to. So we'll figure a way to get that out to everybody. Yeah, and just to build on that presentation that Secretary Moore Julie put together at first glance is the one that was then taken by Climate Access and then given the facelift to make it pretty marketable. And that is what we've been talking about as we think about revisions and updates to the website, of which we can talk about later this spring, but we're thinking about a pretty pivoting the website to really focus on climate action implementation. And we have been thinking about having a placeholder there to really have that, all the materials, the presentation, a facilitation guide, fact sheets, the summary, so that any one person could pick up and do a presentation that speaks to the work of the council on the climate action plan.
Nice. Okay. Leslie Ann, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. And I just wanted to echo Kelly's suggestion. I think it's an awesome one. And I think I've been doing that for the last little bit. Every time I give a presentation, every time I teach something in one of my classes, I always bring up all of the work that was done leading up to the plan itself, but also a lot of the results and the things that we hope to get out of it and ways of strategizing on implementing it. And not just here in Vermont. I mean, I gave a presentation last week in Ohio State and actually sort of brought all of the pieces from ag and from the just transition into that space and also into like the national climate assessment space. So trying to get the word out as broadly as possible is yet another way of our doing that. So thanks for raising that, Kelly. I think it's an awesome way of doing it.
I wondered just, Leslie Ann, for instance, if you have presentation materials and things like that you've put together, I wonder if you want to coordinate with Jane and Marion just so that perhaps they can be useful tools for others going forward. Just a thought.
Yeah, so I gave a keynote presentation last year through the lens of vulnerability and inclusion, which is the same lens that we wrote the climate change piece in the plan itself. And so I have a whole presentation I do whenever people ask me to do something about climate change that always weaves in either my work in my classes and or the stuff that we do in the council itself. So yeah, happy to chit chat a little bit more on ways of bringing some of those pieces to bear.
Great. Okay. All right. Anything else on this? I think for folks who haven't spoken, is it that we're hitting the right notes here, or you want a little more time to think about it? Is there anything sort of, you want to flag now, like, I'm still not totally sure about this aspect of it? Anything that folks need to flag? Okay, great. All right. Fantastic. So that's stay tuned. There will be updates on that. In particular, these online sessions we're going to be doing will happen within a month or so. So stay tuned for those, and all of you can help spread the word about them once they're scheduled. Okay. So why don't we go forward and do a round of updates from the subcommittees and hear what else is going on in addition to what you've heard about just transitions. No particular order here, but I have on my list rural resilience. So Erica or others, I'm just quick saying about Erica, do you want to carry that?
I can. I just want to be sure, just for the general update for the committee.
Yeah, what's going on? And then if you have some questions about sort of particular task group conversations, then we can cover that with those who are more engaged in the different task groups.
Sure. So just as a reminder, the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee is meeting on a monthly basis, and our focus is primarily around developing the climate toolkit to do in the Global Warming Solutions Act, as well as developing the Municipal Vulnerability Index as a part of that. So we have two subgroups of the subcommittee that have been formed. The Climate Toolkit Subcommittee has met, and so they are working with Marion, who has graciously drafted a scope of that toolkit, and it looks great. And then moving forward, we anticipate a cross agency, cross committee subgroup on the Municipal Vulnerability Index to get moving as hopefully funding is approved for that. Our next meeting is in a couple weeks, so we'll be touching base on those items.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Erica.
I'll just say that the Municipal Vulnerability Index Task Group has met now. And the job in front of me this week for our meeting next week is to put together the same scope that Marion did on behalf of you, the climate toolkit, as well as draft the components of what an RFP would look like to go out to bid for the Municipal Vulnerability Index. So we took a little while longer to stand up the group, but it's a robust group comprised of folks from Just Transitions, Rural Resilience, as well as Science and Data. And we're thinking about how to advance the work of the Municipal Vulnerability Index and how we define vulnerability out of the gate. So looking at existing tools and understanding what rural resilience already looked at over the course of the last year. So.
Great. Okay. Super. All right. Unless, any questions for Erica on that work? Okay, great. Let's, Ag and Ecosystem. Abby and Billy.
Morning.
Morning.
Morning. Billy, you want to go
Sure.
on filling gaps, or you want me to?
Sure, that's fine. So Ag and Ecosystem, we met most recently in early February. We're going to meet again later in March. At this point, we have kind of three pieces of work potentially on our radar. One is supporting the work to develop the Municipal Vulnerability Index that you just heard about, if our input is appropriate. The other is supporting development of an RFP for the agricultural emissions inventory, if and when funding is identified for that. And then the third is participating in the Biomass task group. So again, you know, we're discussing how to involve, we've identified individuals from the subcommittee to participate in those three items if and when they move forward. And we'll come back again later this month to kind of talk about where relevant legislation stands and the best framework for us to meet going forward, given how we anticipate those pieces playing out. So I think that's high level. We can talk more about biomass. Obviously, that's where kind of the substantive work is happening right now. But Abby, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Great.
Okay. So I don't know, David, if you want me to go into kind of an overview of where the biomass task group is now, or
Yeah. Why don't you? I think that is, like you say, the sort of significant substantive piece that you're all helping to oversee.
So this is a kind of joint task group between Ag and Ecosystems and rural, and cross sector. So certainly the cross sector representatives should feel free to speak in addition. And we had our first meeting, I guess it was last week, and maybe it was actually our second meeting. We met twice. Our first meeting was kind of a stage setting conversation. After that meeting, Jane and Pat from CBI put a survey out to task group members to help identify our interests and the scope of the work and kind of how close or distant we are on relative topics. We reconvened last week and spent the majority of our hour and a half trying to nail down what exactly our focus is, what our scope is, kind of what the charge to the task group is. As a result of that, I believe Jane and Pat from CBI have developed kind of a couple sentence articulation of what the scope of our task is. I assume that will be circulated with the group shortly, and then we'll kind of reconvene to work on that the next time we meet. And, I think one of the challenges, this is a necessary step because one of the challenges we face is that, biomass can be a very broad or narrow topic depending on how you define it. And it also pulls on many different threads that impact other sections of the climate action plan, other topics, other areas that different subcommittees and the council itself has already acted on. So trying to understand exactly where those intersects exist and how far the council would like us to go or not down those paths is important. So I think that's why the scoping conversation is a pretty critical one. So I'll leave it at that. Obviously, Liz and Rich and TJ and others participate on that task group. So I defer to them on their perspective.
Super. Thanks, Billy. I see a hand up. Jane, is that you?
Well, I have a comment that I raised the hand for it that will come. I'll wait until after the biomass conversation, but Julie has
Perfect.
a comment.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, my
Nope.
question is really just, and Billy and Abby, not sure what your plans are, but how to sort of put some sideboards around the scope of the biomass conversation. I know that we left it as an open item in the climate action plan, but there was work that had been done, and just want to make sure we're sort of hewing to what I felt like was a fairly narrow charge back to the work group from the council, and not kind of overly broadening the scope at this point. I don't know if it's helpful for the council to weigh in here at all, or if you feel like there's a sort of shared understanding in terms of the scope of what the work group is hopefully undertaking.
I think there is now, and I think Jane has done some work to capture that in writing. I just looked at it moments ago, so I don't have kind of a final thoughts on it, but I think it is pretty aligned with what you just articulated, really looking at what had already been presented to the council as a kind of working recommendation out of ag and ecosystems, and to decide how, if, and to bring those recommendations forward, or things similar to them.
Excellent. Thanks, Billy. I'll look forward to seeing the document.
If I may jump in, I'm not a part of the biomass group, but I did watch it, and I do just want to flag that I am really concerned by what I saw in the last meeting in terms of the dynamics that played out, and how the conversation generally was handled. So I understand that we want to be aware of what our scope is, but I also think some really valid concerns were raised regarding which subcommittee's authority trumps others, and sort of the dangers that we run into when we try to narrow the scope so much to make it feel manageable, but all of the nuance that we lose in the process, and the fact that anytime we're talking about something regarding a natural system or the integration of working within an ecosystem to produce a product, it's a complex thing. And siloing is how we've come to where we are. So I want to be really sure that this conversation is being facilitated in a way that doesn't cut off our nose to spite our face.
That sounds like some really tricky concerns. I wonder, others, building on Abby's concerns, have thoughts about this? Maybe those who participate in these conversations. Joey?
Well, I did not participate in that conversation, so I don't have the context that, to bring to answer that question. So I had just a question for Jane, and then a couple of thoughts. Did Billy just articulate what you are recommending as the scope, or can you put a finer point on for me, just so I understand what you're recommending as the scope?
Yes,
I Jane just put it in the chat.
I had Marion put it in the chat for everybody. And,
Okay.
and to get to Abby's point, just please notice the last sentence. It tries to understand that the recommendations as currently put forward non-consensus by Ag and Eco, which will be the starting point. Also, it does implicate other components of the climate action plan likely. And while that doesn't necessarily mean that as it implicates things that becomes within scope, that should just be noted is how we were dealing with this. So we should identify where there is conflict and then can consider that at a later date with the council. So it's not like to ignore, but appreciating that it will touch other components, and that doesn't necessarily pull it within scope.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Jane. Just a couple of thoughts. I had to sort of demur from participating in part because the transportation work is big and a significant lift. So a couple of thoughts related to this. I just think this is a big, important, and nuanced conversation, as Abby just articulated, and I think we all know, and I'm a little sort of unclear of the purview of this task group and even the council's role in it. It's a little unclear to me. But fundamentally, I guess one of the things I would say, a couple things is it seems like, well, two things, that we're not starting this conversation from scratch. The state has done, for a decade plus, some really important work on this issue. That seems like an important foundation upon which to build in terms of, what we're beginning to prioritize as a state in terms of thermal lead application and making the most, carbon beneficial, sustainable use of limited resources. So I would hope, and I don't know to what degree, the focus of this conversation is building there, but I would hope it would. But also fundamentally, it seems hard to have this really important conversation without a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment. It seems like that, and we're going to get to that conversation later in general. I do hope that the council recommends urging the funding and the work to do a complementary life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment, because that seems fundamental to our ability to recommend programs based on a full and a more full view of, apples to apples approaches to keeping people warm, getting where we need to go. So that seems like really important to do potentially first. I don't know how we have this conversation and how we focus this conversation without that. I'm happy to explore that further, but that ultimately seems super fundamental. And anyway, those are two things I just want to offer, is like, what, can we build from what we have, the direction we've pointed as a state to date in terms of, the North Springfield decision. People may not be aware, but VNRC we had intervened in that case for an electric-led large-scale biomass facility, and the Public Utility Commission recognized the importance of having a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions accounting in place for new plants, in addition to accounting for existing large-scale plants as well, which so there's important precedent to build from there. And I think it connects to that need for a complementary life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment. And again, the good work that is in the comprehensive energy plan, we can even look to the renewable energy standard and how it points to thermal lead applications. And then of course, all the important land use considerations that we need to take into account to maintain forests as forests and ensure, that wood that is procured goes through sustainable harvest and procurement practices, and we have parameters in place. So I'm just sort of grappling with, this is a really important conversation. I want to contextualize it. It seems like in the what other work we need to do, and thinking about the transportation piece is really top of mind for me. So I don't think that they are mutually exclusive, but in terms of the analyses that we need and the capacity we have, I'm just wondering how we can focus both of these conversations in an efficient way.
Thanks, Joey. Yeah. Liz?
Yeah, thanks. Something Joey just said made me want to just pop up my hand, because it's a really good insight, Joey, that you just had about it is so nuanced. It's not maybe just even life cycle. I came to the conversation on biomass as a cross-sector subcommittee member, and not an expert on biomass, energy policy background, but not specifically on biomass. And I was struck that it may be some analysis or further study even beyond life cycle emissions. I mean, what I was struck with was just the complexity of the land use conversation and some other aspects of it, that your point that perhaps we're too early, and I don't know if that's one of the reasons that the subcommittee originally did not come to a consensus resolution, but it felt like maybe that was part of it. And so I am wondering whether we're needing some further groundwork before proceeding, just having sat through 2 of the meetings and appreciating what both you said and what Abby said before you about the nuance of it.
Thanks, Liz. Chris Campany?
Yeah, I'm just from a practical reality. You know, when Vermont Yankee closed, we were asked to help manage a regional modern wood heat program to help convert schools and other large buildings to chips or pellets. And right when that happened, at the time, heating oil prices were relatively high, and the uptake rate for it was kind of a hard sell because when the proposal first came out, heating oil prices were relatively high, then they tanked. And so we really had to do a lot of outreach to encourage schools to think about it. Now, just looking at on the Department of Public Service page, number 2 heating oil is at $4.63 a gallon. I suspect interest in modern wood heat systems is going to again surge for all kinds of uses. So this is a much bigger conversation, I think, than just the council. It's a statewide policy discussion. I know that in part there's some public concern about, I mean, I totally get and appreciate the concern about what it's going to do to the forests. And I think there's a complicating discussion there because of what's being done with regard to biomass harvesting in different parts of the country. I know where I came from in the Southeast, you know, the chipping of bottomland hardwood forests to send pellets to Germany kind of rubs me the wrong way. That's a little different than using local wood in local systems and local distribution center systems. But maybe, I don't know what kind of strategic conversation the state is having as a whole about this, but that's probably going to need to happen because I doubt we're going to see a change in oil prices dramatically, depending on what happens in the Middle East and elsewhere. You know, chances are the oil is going to stay high, pretty high, so it's going to make wood more competitive. So the markets may just drive some of that conversation.
Okay, yeah. Abby?
Just to better clarify too, where I was trying to go was to Chris's point, I don't sense that we're in a moment where the need to think about relying on our own, not being NIMBY about our energy sources, right? In other words, like there are ways in which renewable fuel sources can come from Vermont's forests, for example. And, we have ways to do that sustainably, I believe. And that's certainly all appropriate discussion. My substantive concern is the how the conversation is happening. There was a lot said, and, Joey just brought this up again. I know that the state has done a lot of work. I know there is a lot on paper already. I also know that biomass is hardly a remotely settled issue nationally or globally. And that some of that is sort of spinning along quite rapidly. And my concern is in the context of a just transition, either we're interested in having these conversations through the lens of a just transition or not. What I saw play out was not. And that's my concern. People who are coming to these discussions are potentially new to these discussions. They haven't been invited before. And so we need to have patience, we need to have humility, and we need to be able to understand that we might have to talk through some things that for some of us, they feel settled, but for other people who are coming to the table for the first time or for whom their voice has been shut out previously, it's not settled. And this is where the work is. And what I witnessed was not a great demonstration of where I feel we need to be in terms of holding space for productive and just conversations to transpire.
Okay. Okay. All right, so that's a fair amount of conversation around biomass with some concerns raised about the way those conversations are happening, some concerns raised about scope and what that means, and some thoughts around scope. Okay. And a question mark about whether, what additional analysis is needed so that that conversation feels constructive. Right. The beautiful conference table has something, has a hand up.
I did, just with respect to one other point that Billy and Abby touched on with the work of Ag and Eco, I did just want to highlight that with the support and help from Ag Agency, A&R submitted a grant application on Friday of last week to support further examining the ag portion of the emissions inventory and the natural working land sector components of work. Also related, but not formally part of this work, A&R submitted an application with Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island and Connecticut, I believe, to look at the forest sector also. So if funded through the U.S. Climate Alliance, we'll have some robust funding to put towards further work in that space around how we quantify ag emissions as well as the forest sector of the greenhouse gas inventory.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Joey?
That is super helpful. Thanks to the state team for doing that. And for me, it's just a question. You raised some unanswered questions, David. Like, what's the timing of this? It's clearly an important conversation where it's definitely not a settled conversation, but there is a foundation upon which to build. And it sounds like some more important information may be coming out of those analyses if they're funded. So for me, it's more about a question of sort of timing and what's the conversation we should be having and doing, and what's the work we should be doing now, and what else needs to be done to have, a more informed conversation with some of that work. And again, I'd put out there, needing a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment as one other component of it. So for me, it's just a question of the timing, again, with limited staff capacity and resources, like how this fits into some of the other work. And again, I can't help but think about that related to the transportation work as we try to fill in the blanks with limited, capacity. Although I'm very much relying heavily on the state team and they're doing incredible support work, but I want to contextualize this in everything we're trying to lift, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, thanks, Joey.
Just briefly, I just wanted to remind folks, because it'll come up again later in our conversation, both when Joey and Rich and Commissioner Walk speak to the ongoing work of cross-sector and transportation, but then thinking about analyses needed. The substantive work of the council, both the transportation space and biomass that were tabled, were both identified to move forward on a timeline of coming back to the council this spring in June for consideration. Transportation, you will hear from shortly, has, with the support of cross-sector, is looking to revisit that timeline and think about the fall as a more appropriate timeline to reconvene as a council to consider recommendations. Biomass task group hasn't gotten that far yet to think about what the timeline, if the timeline of the spring is appropriate to reconsider the tabled actions or whether a longer timeline is needed. So just wanted to flag that that's out there. And I think at the next biomass task group, thinking about process and timeline will be important.
Thanks, Jane. Okay. Well, that is a good segue to cross-sector in an update that speaks to things beyond what we've already heard. So Rich or others who would want to provide an update about what cross-sector is working on.
Peter, do you want to begin?
Rich, I'm happy to defer to you if you'd like to go first.
Okay. Well, as you've heard, cross-sector has been working on, well, three things, really. We've been following and contributing to the work in the legislature on the clean heat standard. which, as I assume pretty much everybody knows, has been reported out of House Energy and Technology Committee. We've been supporting the work of the Transportation Working Group and of the and we've been meeting along with the Biomass Task Group as well. Anything else you want to report, Peter?
Yeah, just related to the biomass piece, I think that's the conversation that we're having today is really important. I also, obviously we each of the subcommittees have 3 members on those groups, and that's important for having a defined body to get that work done. I do think it's going to be important that not only do we figure out in terms of what the charge and how it's going to work, but opportunity to reflect the other interests of the subcommittees on there as well, because there's expertise and experience in the subcommittees that goes beyond just the 3 individuals that were selected to participate. And so I would just sort of offer that's so having some time, whether that's a joint meeting between the 2 subcommittees to talk about the work or what have you, to work through some of those pieces before some point as to sort of we're engaging this process. I'm not sure how that works, but I think it's another thing that we ought to think about how to define or at least what the space for that conversation looks like moving forward. I think other than that, we have the ongoing transportation tasks, which we've talked about already. And I think it's, we continue to monitor these sort of what moves forward in the legislature, what does not, as we come towards the end of the session. I don't know, it doesn't feel that way yet, but we're not that far. And so it'll be interesting to see sort of what hasn't been accomplished and therefore what that means for our plan, frankly, and what that means for the work of A&R in terms of rulemaking. So anyways, that's more just sort of what's on my brain than what's on our subcommittee's tasks at this point.
Thanks, Peter. Rich. Okay. And we've spoken a little bit about the transportation subgroup already. Although if folks want to just say anything more about that, this is a perfectly good time to do that. Is that a hand? Yeah, go ahead.
Just unrelated to the task group work, but I do hope Jared and Joey and others who are participating in transportation will speak to that. But really quickly, another big thing that cross-sector has been overseeing and has come to completion is the Vermont Pathways report and the modeling work with Cadmus and EFG. That I have, and my apologies, it posted, I believe I shared it with the council via email and offered you all the opportunity to sit in on cross-sector if you wanted to have a run-through presentation, but Marion and I will work to get it posted on the resources page so you have access to that report going forward if you'd like to use it. But the contract with Cadmus and EFG is wrapping up now, and so we'll be closing out that contract in the next few weeks, just as an FYI.
Great. Okay.
David, really quickly, Jane hit on it, but I just want to put a finer point on it because I don't think we've had a climate council meeting since we actually wanted to ask the council's support for the more time component of it. The CAP says we should deliver our recommendations by June. We think more time is warranted. I think we flagged that, but I don't know if we just want to make sure people are okay with that, and we're going to need that time.
Can you say just a touch more about that? And let's get the council to weigh in. Describe that additional time that you'd like and what you're thinking about that.
Well, we had said we'd given ourselves sort of a self-imposed deadline of June to come up with another set of recommendations. And as we were beginning to meet and look at all the work we need to do to look at, other options, which we laid out in our initial memo to you, which those options include, policy and regulatory tools, looking at things like a clean transportation standard, the Western Climate Initiative, a cap and invest program that our neighbors to the north in Quebec and California are participating in, potentially, a fee bait, and then continuing to explore maybe the viability of TCIP. So we laid that out in a memo. That's a lot of things to consider. TCIP was explored for over a decade, we need a little bit more time to begin to really like lay out the different sort of characteristics and potential benefits and ramifications of different approaches, and thought that, most of our recommendations are likely going to require some legislative support, and the legislature doesn't reconvene until January of 2023. So we thought we could take a little bit more time to do better public engagement process and spend a little bit more time looking at options, and then deliver to the council on a little bit of a later timeline, but in time for any potential bill drafting or whatever to still happen, but more time for analysis and public engagement.
Great. So I guess my question to the council is, any concerns about that as Joey describes it? Any pushback or feelings? I see some thumbs up from folks. And any concerns about doing that we should raise up right now, Rich?
I don't have any concern about it. Obviously, it's going to take some time for the working group to come up with its recommendations. And I would just say the same thing is going to be true, I think, of biomass. It's as people have said, a complicated topic. It's got multiple arms and legs to it. And I think it's going to take us some time to work through the issues. And I would think that will be useful for the committees and also for the working group to organize the work in a way that prioritizes the topics that we can probably address pretty quickly, and then see whether or not we can order them in a way that makes the conversation productive for the benefit of the whole council.
Okay, great. Okay, so barring any concerns I hear right now, let's assume for transportation folks, yes, council seems to be on board with your request. And as biomass starts to get their planning a little bit more together, I wouldn't be surprised if they come out with a similar request. Peter?
This is more of a process question, and we don't need an answer for it right now, but just something to think about. The timeline is roughly laid out in the plan. And so it would be good to figure out how we plan to capture adjustments to the plan, such as this this is relatively minor, but there may be other things that change or are modified over the course of time or updated, and how we reflect those for folks to where the council has weighed in and made those adjustments, so that folks at home can track those would be useful.
Thanks, Peter. And I think it also reflects something I've heard from Jane as well about sort of the products of this year's work, right? And what we call that, what you all call that. Is it an addendum? What's the word I'm looking for? Addenda or amendment to the plan. What is it? I know, Jane, you've done a little bit of thinking about that. And maybe that can speak to Peter's concern as well, as you all as a council make some decisions that alter a little bit what's in the version that came out on December 1. Okay, great. So what am I thinking? Science and data subcommittee. I know you've been participating in some of these task groups. Are there other things you'd like to share about what's going on in science and data?
Thanks, David. Yeah, a few quick updates. So the first is we've had a little bit of changing composition of the subcommittee. So really glad to have the subcommittee having recommended and the steering committee approved Claire McElveny from the Public Service Department as a subcommittee member. And now that TJ Poore has moved into a new role at the Public Service Department, he has stepped away from co-chairing science and data, is now serving on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. And so now we're lucky to have Megan O'Toole from the Agency of Natural Resources as our new co-chair on science and data. A few other things, just a reminder, this goes for other subcommittees as well, that we have until March 15th to receive nominations for additional subcommittee members. for the Science and Data Subcommittee in particular, we're hoping to find folks, and we've already gotten some great nominations, but it would be good to have additional if folks are still considering or can think of folks, but particularly looking for people with expertise and experience related to life cycle emissions accounting, looking to resilience metrics, and also economics experience and expertise. So again, March 15th is the deadline there. The other exciting update is thanks to great work by the team at ANR and a subgroup that helped with the review and revisions of an RFI related to a request for information related to supplemental life cycle greenhouse gas emissions accounting. That deadline to receive RFI responses was on Friday, and we received 5 different responses, some of which are very good, very helpful. And the task group that has formed on that within Science and Data will be meeting this week to do initial discussion of the RFIs that came in. Of course, the big question going forward is the kind of timeline and resources to be able to take that information that we got in response and frame up in advance a request for proposals, which I think is absolutely necessary, both in terms of compliance with the Global Warming Solutions Act and in terms of, a number of other related questions, including the Clean Heat Standard, including these biomass discussions that are ongoing. So let's see, our next meeting as a subcommittee, we had delayed a little bit until Wednesday, March 23rd. That'll be from 2 to 4 p.m. We wanted to make sure that we had given enough time to both receive those RFI responses on life cycle accounting and received all of the subcommittee nominations to consider. And yeah, I guess I would just say also in relation to the biomass task group, I know that there are a number of strong opinions on those topics. I know that it's very nuanced and complicated. I hope and I trust that there's a commitment to making sure that a lot of those conversations are grounded in are evidence-based and grounded in the latest and highest quality available kind of science and analysis on this, of which, there are different outcomes. This is a very complicated topic. So I do understand that there are members of the Science and Data Subcommittee who are ready, willing, and able to participate in those conversations. And I think it's really important that they are able to, in addition to and alongside folks from Ag and Ecosystems and the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee. So I think that's it for now from Science and Data.
Thanks, Jared. Helpful. Any questions for Jared or for folks who've been involved in the Science and Data work? Any questions about any of that work? Excellent news about getting a good response to that RFI. Okay.
Thank you to Jane and Megan and Colin and Jeff and everybody who worked on that directly and helped to review it. It's a really important step forward.
Great. And as Jared said, there is an open call for nominations for subcommittees, subcommittee membership. And all of you can help spread that word in your networks and to see if others would come and lend some new types of expertise and lived experience in the subcommittees. So most subcommittees are looking for new membership. And so that is open. And Jane, I don't know if, or Marion, if you want to throw in the chat, is the tool being used or the survey mechanism being used for that?
I linked it in the chat, and so folks can use that link to share with your networks and content.
Oh, there it is. Yep. Sorry, it's right there in the chat. Okay. Thanks. All right. So that was a sort of cover the waterfront of all the activity happening. And I know we actually do have just a one slide that shows all the different task groups. I wonder if we want to put that up just quickly to show for folks who are not as involved in this work, so everybody knows the breadth of work going on. And if you are interested in getting more involved in some of this work, absolutely reach out to subcommittee members who are helping to lead it, or Jane and Marion can always point you in the right direction too. Do you want me to pull up that slide? Okay, you're doing it great.
Hey, David, I also, since Just Transitions, both Sue and Abby aren't here, I just wanted to comment on the ongoing work of Just Transitions briefly beyond the public engagement focus.
Great.
Just briefly, just so folks know, there has been a shift. Sarah Phillips, who was representing Sean Brown and amazing capacity building for Just Transitions, will still be on Just Transitions, but we're welcoming Abby Willard from the Ag Agency to step in as co-chair of that subcommittee. That group of state staff that support that subcommittee and the co-chairs met last Thursday, along with David, to think about their upcoming meeting, not this week, but next week. And that subcommittee continues to focus on carrying forward the work of public engagement, but also thinking about the long-term implementation of the guiding principles and scoring rubric and what that looks like as in the ongoing work of the council. They also have been invited to speak on that work at UVM and in other venues. So the main focus of the subcommittee is really around public engagement and then the application of the scoring rubric and guiding principles. And they too are also accepting subcommittee nominations to broaden out and bring capacity to bear in that space. So Chris, Campany, others, Kelly, if I missed anything else around work, David too, you're really intimately involved, please. But I just did want to say that that subcommittee is active and meeting still as well.
Thanks, Jane. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So on the screen, you can see the different task groups that are happening. Two of them, the biomass and transportation, are sort of the substantive ones that are dealing with those tabled issues from last year. The public engagement we've talked about earlier today. Others are about tools or various deliverables that are part of the Climate Council responsibilities, the Municipal Vulnerability Index, the Climate Toolkit, and the Measuring and Assessment Progress Tool. And then the others are analyses that are in different stages. And Jane or Marion, you can do this better than I could, frankly. But that's it. It feels like a lot going on right now. And I think what's happening is the way the work's getting done is cross-pollinating more across subcommittees to focus on specific tasks and push those tasks forward. Marion or Jane, anything else?
The only thing that we haven't spoken about yet at this meeting is the Measuring and Assessing Progress tool. And just so folks know, that has been managed by a task group from Science and Data up to this point. We were working really with, that was a task within the original Cadmus and EFG contract to frame out what that tool would look like. Because of the understanding and expectation of the cost of building that tool, we've decided to close out the contract with EFG and Cadmus, knowing that we wouldn't have enough capacity, or it was not in the original scope of that contract to have them see through building that tool. And so as we pivot to talking about ongoing technical analyses, where we are working to put out an RFP for both the scoping of that Measuring and Assessing Progress tool, and then the ultimate building of it that is required in the GWSA statute. And that framework of what we would do was part of the original climate action plan, and Shepherd did to a point with Cadmus and EFG and Science and Data. But as that RFP moves forward, I expect that to be not dissimilar to the other task groups, in that it'll be cross-cutting, because the database and the Measuring and Assessing Progress tool that I think of as a database will think about more than just emissions reductions. It will think about how we measure and track progress with resilience and adaptation. It also speaks to impacts of climate change on natural resources and wildlife, as well as broad impacts of climate changes in Vermont. So the statute is quite broad on what that tool will do, and as a result, we'll probably draw on expertise across different subcommittees.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Okay. All right. So that's the work happening. Thank you for the feedback on that work. In particular, the biomass conversation seems like there's some real thinking that needs to go in and shaping that in a way that feels constructive and in line with our just transitions principles. Again, stressing the importance of, March 15th deadline for this nominations for subcommittee memberships. All of you can help spread through networks or try to recruit folks you think would be particularly helpful. Anything else before we take a break? Okay, great. So let's do this. Let's come back at 12:30 and we'll dive into some decisions around budgeting and technical analysis that you all need to make, and a work plan and the legislative update. And we'll do public comment at the end of our meeting as always. So we'll see you at 12:30. We can pause the recording. And if you want to turn off your video, and we'll see you back here in about 12 minutes. Okay. All right, so we're coming back from break here. Before we get going, I'm just looking at numbers. It looks like we have a critical mass of folks with their cameras back on. I was just saying to Chris Campany, I've been noticing in the chat a lot of information he's putting in on the commodity disruption and what that could mean for pressure on land and other things. Chris, do you want to say a word about that before we get back to our agenda?
Yeah, just brief. I mean, well, we've not been in this specific circumstance before, but we've been in this similar situation before. And so while I think, there are a lot of folk who I imagine are going to be thinking about the need to make the transition to renewables and reducing greenhouse gases and dependence on foreign oil and other goods. I would just suggest we really, maybe next council meeting when things will be a bit more clear, but we do need to be cognizant of our messaging going forward, because we've seen what's happened in the past when grain prices especially surge in terms of not only what happens to agricultural production and how it actually it can reverse a lot of efforts to try to better sequester carbon, but then there's also the whole food side of this, and that's why I posted reminders of what happened in 2008 with globally as foods were basically diverted into fuel, what that wreaked around the world. And so I imagine we're going to see that again. But even other things, like if you look at just how much we're dependent on Russia for aluminum and nickel, those prices are going up, and that has to do with a lot with what's going to happen in our converting to more electric uses, and then their implications, even with China global trade, reluctance or concerns about being as dependent on authoritarian governments. And so there's articles now about whether or not some companies might start pivoting away, but that gets to reliance on them for solar panels and automobile components and lots of other things. So the point I'm making is this is going to be highly disruptive. And as a council, we need to kind of recognize the impacts of this on everyday people, so that as we communicate with them about what's in the climate action plan, we also recognize what the impacts of what's going on in the world are going to impact on the recommendations in the climate action plan and how we're implemented. Otherwise, we might come across as just completely detached and separated from reality. So that reality will become more clear over the coming weeks, but I think we probably need to settle into the assumptions that this is a long haul situation. And it's not like we're just going to have, again, unless OPEC does something dramatic and other things, we're not going to see just dramatic drops in oil prices again, or a lot of other commodities out there too. So just wanted to make that point.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. Okay. All right. So we had put on the agenda now to talk about budgeting for the council work and related work to the GWSA and the technical analyses. And here, Secretary Moore has a presentation that she prepared. It's linked in your agenda. And I think that's the way we're going to walk into this. Am I correct that Julie, you want to make a presentation?
Yes, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Oh, yeah. Yep. Oh, well, let's see if I can. Ah, perfect. All right.
Yep.
Great. So just thought I could give a quick high-level overview of the FY23 budget and the governor's recommended budget, the climate initiatives that are contained therein, and just a little bit on the process that remains in front of us. So as folks, I assume are generally aware, the governor's budget included more than $250 million worth of proposed investments in climate action. And it's actually sort of 4 or 5 different flavors of money, depending on how you want to count. The first is the base funding for the climate office that's in ANR's budget. That's a total of $1.1 million. The legislature had appropriated $450 million or $450,000, excuse me, starting in FY21, and this increases that base GF amount to 1.1 million. That's largely to cover staff. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. There's also a one-time general fund allocation that's included in the governor's recommend. And between some of the carry forward funds we have from FY21, as well as a bit of contractor capacity within our base budget, the estimate was that $75,000 was what was required in order to sort of fulfill our commitments to develop a municipal vulnerability index and the work around tracking and monitoring progress. The governor recommended a package of ARPA investments. We'll also talk about that in a bit more detail, that total just over $160 million. There's a $10 million proposed FEMA hazard mitigation match that appears in the budget for Vermont Emergency Management. And then there's a separate tranche of funding called the Federal Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. It's $113 million in total. That's essentially Vermont's for the asking, should we put forward eligible projects? And there is an exciting project in that space related to climate as well. So just quickly, the Office of Climate Action, as proposed, would be a division within the Agency of Natural Resources Central Office. It would have a total of 8 positions, including Jane and Marion's existing positions, along with a couple of other existing positions within the agency. And the intention of it is to create this long-term intergovernmental structure to support our climate action work, as well as the ongoing assessment of tracking climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience activities, and a leading role around communication and engagement with Vermonters. So as I noted, the budget includes this $450,000 that was first appropriated as part of the agency's base budget in FY21, adds $650,000 in FY23 for that total of 1.1 million, and is really intended to cover the costs of the staff, program operations, overhead, and per diems paid to counselors. In addition, there have been 2 one-time appropriations related to climate action that are really focused on technical analyses and our ability to secure contractor support. There was $1 million in the FY21 budget adjustment, and then the $75,000 I noted in this year's budget. So just at a high level, looking at the revenues we've received or anticipating and the expenses going out the other end. This is a follow-on with a bit more detail to a conversation we had at the last steering committee meeting. Staff costs, operating expenses, and council member per diems, if you sort of add up those top 4 lines, come in right about $1 million. We have some ongoing or under contract services around the website, Consensus Building Institute, and David's team, the Cadmus Group, as well as Kaya Morris. And then we have other pieces of work that are either planned or actually in progress at this point. The total expenses is just north of $2 million, leaving us with an unobligated balance currently of $103,000. This is all contingent on the legislature fully funding the governor's recommend in this space. So both the $650,000 to fill out the budget of the climate office, as well as that $75,000 worth of one-time money. In terms of the ARPA-funded climate initiatives, as I noted, they total just north of $160 million, and about half of that proposed funding in the governor's budget would go into weatherization efforts. Approximately another quarter would go into transportation electrification, including both incentives as well as investments in charging infrastructure. And this was ultimately anticipated to combine and amplify the impact of an additional $20 or so million that the Agency of Transportation is anticipating will be made available to them through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that has passed Congress. The governor's recommend includes $20 million for upgrading electric service for low-income households, recognizing that this is a necessary precursor to often both heat pumps as well as the ability to charge electric vehicles at home. There's $2 million earmarked for load management and battery storage. The next item is building on work that was initiated in FY22 around hazard mitigation buyouts. Again, this is an initiative that's being led by Vermont Emergency Management. There was $6 million for this work in FY22. The governor's proposed an additional $15 million of ARPA funds for hazard mitigation buyouts. And as a companion to that, $10 million in one-time general fund monies to ensure that we're able to take full advantage of the unprecedented FEMA match or FEMA hazard mitigation funding that is available. And then finally, the governor's budget includes $7.5 million for what I would describe as working in natural lands initiatives. This one was a little bit tougher, frankly, in terms of looking at the requirements or the limitations around the ARPA funding to identify eligible activities from the Climate Action Plan and the recommendations of the council. But the governor's budget does include $5 million for agronomic practices on Vermont farms, $1.5 million for the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters initiative that's really championed by the Vermont Food Bank and connecting low-income Vermonters with Vermont farmers, and then $1 million for an urban tree planting initiative. I think it's worth noting, almost all of this work is outside of ANR's budget, with the exception of $1 million for urban tree planting and an investment in some charging infrastructure at state parks and fishing access areas. But again, by virtue of the climate office, ANR is going to perform this intergovernmental coordination work, and therefore is really serving as the unofficial spokesperson for this overall climate package. And then finally, this federal coronavirus capital project fund. So the state of Vermont is slated to receive $113 million and will need to put forward a proposal to the U.S. Treasury by September of this year. The governor has recommended 4 different potential investments. I know that the legislature and judicial branches are also working on recommendations for how best to invest these funds. But one of the governor's recommendations circled here in red is around resilient community centers, which would provide grants for community-facing public facilities to improve existing spaces. A component of this needs to be creating areas where community members have access to broadband, but also can be then used to invest to improve sort of the livability or not sure what the word is I'm looking for. I'm going to go with livability of these spaces and make them more comfortable as truly functional civic spaces by improving heating and ventilation, air quality, weatherization, among others. And this, I think, is a really exciting opportunity to address a couple of core needs, both in terms of connectivity, but also investing in the climate friendliness of some of these public buildings. Oh, I had a whole slide on that, sorry. And then finally, just a current status of where these different initiatives lie. They're all in the House still, and probably will be for the next week or two. In front of House appropriations is what's sometimes referred to as the big bill. It includes the base and one-time general fund requests related to the Climate Action Office, as well as the whole of the budget of state government. House Natural Resources did send a memo to the House Appropriations Committee just before the town meeting break that supported the governor's recommendations around the Climate Office. In addition, House Appropriations is working on the ARPA funding requests. As you may have heard, the legislature is in the final throes of preparing this year's Budget Adjustment Act. That Budget Adjustment Act includes some expenditures of ARPA funds that the governor didn't account for in making his recommendations as part of the FY23 budget. And it is likely the legislature will need to reduce the spending proposed in the governor's ARPA buckets to offset monies that have already been invested by the legislature. I flagged this just in that hopeful counselors are paying attention to these bills as they wind their way through to make sure that climate action remains front of mind. And then finally, the House Corrections and Institutions Committee is taking lead on the federal coronavirus capital projects and building out what that proposal is that will go to US Treasury. There is a somewhat related piece of legislation that's also moving through the House currently, H518, which is a municipal fuel switching grant program. That bill has been voted out of House Energy and Technology, and I believe is also currently with the House Appropriations Committee, but then has quite a bit of overlap with what's envisioned as part of the governor's Resilient Community Centers initiative. And just would leave you with a few points for what I'm hoping will be a robust discussion. The capacity of the Climate Office is finite. I feel like this is an important thing that we not lose sight of. It's an incredibly exciting opportunity from my perspective to have this sort of in the offing. But at the end of the day, it is 8 humans and 8 humans who are going to have a lot of things to do, including managing about $1 million of contracted services, helping coordinate the implementation of that ARPA-funded climate work, developing the system for tracking progress over time. There's the work of the task groups that they're engaged in, and then the ongoing communication. And also interested in discussing as part of this conversation, the role of the council in some of these spaces, engaging the public, reviewing progress as that monitoring system gets built, and then helping further prioritize the technical analyses identified in the climate action plan and developing budget recommendations. Secretary Klauser can talk a little bit about the timeline around budget, but there's also essentially the $100,000 that is sitting on the bottom line of our current budget, and understanding what the highest priority is for technical analyses. So maybe the best thing to do is for me to turn it over to Jane, who can sort of talk through that list of technical analyses.
Thanks, Julie. Would you mind, before we shift to my slide, going back to the budget one?
Yes.
So briefly, I just wanted to provide some clarity on the distinction here between contracted services that are under contract versus in progress or planned. I did just want to, there's a little bit of a blurring of lines here amongst the two, so just wanted to clarify for all of you. First and foremost, what you see up there are the remaining funds that are under contracted services that haven't been invoiced yet. They weren't the total contracted costs, but they're what we expect to be invoiced over the course of the next few weeks to close those contracts out. The one with CBI is a little different. That one, CBI has 77,000 and change remaining on their current contract. And what we are starting to build into our base budget is an understanding and expectation that CBI will continue to support the work of the council long term. And we have an additional $100,000 built into on top of that 77,000 there to support the work of CBI with the council subcommittees and task groups increasingly going forward. So that's work that we're actually going to be putting out for an RFP, a competitive process, in the next month or so, in the expectation that the current contract with CBI is wrapping up. That contract will support that facilitation, but it will also look to wrap in the funding below that speaks to the public engagement implementation that we spoke about earlier with Kelly's support. That 67,000 and change are the funds that we've decommitted from the Climate Access and RISE contract. We closed that contract early and didn't move forward with all of the deliverables, and that is the remaining balance that we plan to put towards CBI, who is stepping in a leadership role in that space. Their contract already spoke to support in that space, but they're really taking on the bulk of that work now. And so that 67,000 is part of that budget that will go to CBI, hopefully, as we think through a competitive process for that. Everything else up above is getting wrapped up, and the other components of this is to date our best understanding of what we will need to put forward in RFPs and contracted services to advance the work of the measuring and assessing progress tool, the municipal vulnerability index, work to support the evaluation of climate change hazards and effects in support with UVM. And then we are holding back $15,000 to support, as Kelly suggested, anybody who comes forward and asks for components of the cap to be translated, that will be added costs for us to bear through the contracts that we have in place to do that work. And as well as thinking about how we shift the website going forward from really being a website and tool for the Climate Council to thinking about how it will serve the Climate Office, as well as the implementation of the Climate Action Plan for Vermonters to come to look for. So I'm just going to pause there and suggest if there's any questions on this current budget that we could talk to these contracted services now, because what we'd like to do is pivot to highlighting the ongoing technical analyses that were prioritized in the Climate Action Plan to hopefully help set the stage for a conversation that David's going to facilitate with all of you around priority setting for this, the $100,000 roughly balance that we have to think about what the Climate Council's priority would be for those funds.
Okay. All right. So before we talk specifically about the prioritization for those remaining funds, I guess it'd be good if there's questions or confusions about what's been presented so far, because it's a lot of different numbers. And so it wouldn't be at all unusual to have a little bit of follow-up questions needed. So is there anything that's not quite clear yet that it'd be important to have a little more clarity from Julie or Jane or somebody else? Catherine?
This is a bit of an awkward question, David, but
yeah,
I'm curious beyond what we see is involved in the $177,000 contract to CBI for facilitation services.
So the 77,000 is what's remaining. And so that is the work that David and his partners do to help support the council and subcommittee meetings. So all the facilitation is in that. It's also work to support the online engagement component of the public engagement strategy, and to a lesser extent, or I should say also the partner support. So some of that money will go also to help lifting up the public engagement strategy. But largely it's around facilitation of these meetings to date. That 100,000, it has yet to be contracted, and that is ongoing support of council and subcommittee work. And that was just a placeholder for us to build a budget with CBI into the future for what it takes and what the capacity will be needed for the council going into the future.
Thanks.
Other questions? Bronwyn?
right before the break, I admit my brain was starting to tank. And so there was something mentioned about the measuring progress tool. And it made me wonder if the thing that I'm looking for might be wrapped into that measuring progress tool. So I was interested in hearing more about the measuring climate impacts, and you've talked about natural and working lands and the climate impact on natural and working lands. And I was planning on bringing up something that I noticed, which is that in the climate action plan, there's a mention of an assessment tool or doing a vulnerability assessment for other economic sectors that is not in this list. But it sounded to me right before the break like it might be wrapped into that measuring progress tool. So I'm just wondering if you can clarify that. And if it is included, then I will put it to rest there. And if it's not included, then I'll probably bring it up later.
Sure. And Marion can help maybe spark my memory, but I'll speak to what I know is there. And I don't remember anything immediate about the economic analysis right now, but let me say that there's the measuring and assessing progress tool, and that is intended to be a multifaceted tool that speaks to emissions reductions and the policy levers we're pulling that we hope will translate into the greenhouse gas inventory. So like how many EVs are on the road, how many, whatever the targets are we choose to measure. It is also intended and spoken to in statute to be more than emissions reductions and also speak to resilience and adaptation metrics, as well as climate and biodiversity metrics, and how we go about framing that within the tool or using other existing tools like the climate assessment is ongoing conversation as we build that. So that's the measuring and assessing progress tool. There's also the Municipal Vulnerability Index. And that is another separate project. And so as far as economic analyses, we did the in-plan modeling as part of the Vermont Pathways report, and there has been some interest, you're right, and maybe this is what you're speaking to, around doing more REMI type modeling with respect to like the economic impacts of specific policy measures, which is not something we did for the climate action plan. And so that is not on the technical analyses spreadsheet that I have here to consider, and it's not in our current budget as well.
Does that cover it?
One thing I will just say is JFO is currently working on their economic analysis report for the whole climate action plan, which is forthcoming. But we haven't made any other additional progress to think about further economic analysis.
Bronwyn, does that sort of answer your question?
I think it does, although I feel like there's still something for me that's missing from this technical analysis list in that case, which is one of the actions in the climate action plan was to do a climate change impact assessment for Vermont's commercial sector. And so I feel like I'm hearing a lot of language around climate impact for natural and working lands. And I'm hearing a lot about measuring progress, including resiliency, but there's just this one piece that's still missing for me. And so I can bring that back up when we go over the technical analyses and prioritizing that. It might be a little bit too, I know we are not, rolling in capacity and money to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to be adding something to the list that, we know we may not be able to float, but just in terms of accuracy of what was asked for in the climate action plan, I just wanted to flag that this particular analysis is missing from the list.
Thank you very much for that. And that I ask other counselors to pay attention to that too, because the technical analyses that I've lifted up into this table are from what was lifted up into the implementation section of the climate action plan. And it's sounding like we may have missed some specific recommendations embedded in the plan that didn't carry forward into the technical analysis list at the end of the plan. So we should carry that up, and that's important to lift up here. So thank you.
Okay. Why don't we look at that list, Jane? This is again linked in the agenda, folks. And it's a list of all the analyses that are, as Jane mentioned, part of the implementation plan of the CAP. And Jane can walk through the ones that are funded, the ones where there's a probable funding source. And then obviously the challenge for all of you is to consider if you had a little bit of funding, which you do with this 100,000 or so, where would we place that? And I will say, and you'll see this in your agenda today, that while we'll do this conversation now, what we really want to talk about as well is a pathway for a more structured way of doing budgeting for this work for next year and subsequent years. It's something that would start in October, for instance, and Secretary Closure will be able to lead us in that. But let's go ahead and look at that list, Jane, and see if there's some obvious things jumping out at us about prioritization of funds.
So it sounds, this was intended to be inclusive. So I hope we can revisit what Bronwyn just brought up and anything else that might be missing. And then also as we consider them, think about the necessary timeline needed to complete them relative to either policy developments or the next implementation iteration of the climate action plan. So I had prepared this on behalf of the steering committee a month or so ago. What you see here now is just the technical analyses recommended that are not anticipated to be funded based on the budget that we just discussed in Secretary Moore's presentation. But I'll walk through and we can talk about if there is a plan to fund them and if that's we're cautiously optimistic, or whether or not we really have no other obligated funds for this priority and think about the relevant timeline for them. So Jared spoke earlier today about the life cycle accounting. This is called out in the statute for the work. It's also relative to the clean heat standard being contemplated in the legislature right now. And it is a priority and has been something that both science and data and cross-sector have been talking about since the onset. We were able to advance the RFI, as Jared brought up, and we now have those responses. We have an estimated cost here of $150,000, and this was an educated guess between myself and the staff of DEC's Air Quality and Climate Division. I will say that I expect this to cost more than $150,000 now based on the based on the questions that we put out in the RFI and the budget that were put forward by the RFI responses. So I imagine this is something that is still a high priority, but we'll be revisiting what the scale and scope is based on the original questions in the RFI as it was envisioned. Earlier, I mentioned when Billy and Abby were speaking about the Ag and Ecosystems update, that a high priority from the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee was to further explore the tools we use to quantify and measure the agricultural emissions, as well as the other sectors in the natural and working land space and the greenhouse gas inventory. These were tools, some of them identified in through the carbon budget work, but also other tools that we haven't looked at all yet. And we have an opportunity through the U.S. Climate Alliance. They have a grant that is through the natural and working land sector specifically to hopefully capitalize on funding in that space to do this work. We have an individual application in for the agricultural sector based largely on the recommendations put forward by Ag and Ecosystems. And then we also have an application, as I mentioned, that's part of a regional partnership to look at the forest sector. Those just went in on Friday, and unfortunately, I don't have a timeline to report out on when we expect to hear back about those, but we have applied for both the maximum amount, which is $100,000 in both of those spaces. So $100,000 is really defined here based on what we hope to get for funding and not necessarily on what it would cost to do the work. But I think it is a realistic expectation, knowing that you'll see on the next line, the carbon budget is also a priority to replicate on a regular basis. The first carbon budget, which was a component of the Cadmus and EFG contract, that task cost $50,000 to produce the first one. So I actually expect that it might cost less going forward, but hope and expect that in future budgets, we'll be able to consider replicating the carbon budget. But that is not budgeted, nor have we anticipate doing that in this coming year. The carbon forecasting is something that we had actually envisioned doing as part of the first carbon budget, and had been looking at consultants who could bring forward the development of the carbon budget and include carbon forecasting in it, but we did not select a consultant who was able to do that. So we had sort of put that work aside with the hope and anticipation that we could contract them in this year. Carbon forecasting is not dissimilar from the business as usual model for in the emission space. It would give us an understanding of what we could expect from our forests and from our working lands into the future if practices weren't changed, so that we would have a baseline, a better understanding of what future projections for carbon sequestration and storage would look like. And this is something that's sort of special. A scientist, Jonathan Thompson, has sort of specialized in doing it, and he actually provided us a budget of $80,000 to do it for Vermont. We had it in our budget for this year, but removed it to have it sort of at play with all the other priorities for you all to consider. This is a recommendation that came out of the Climate Action Plan to hire a consultant to review and assess the state's designation programs that recognize and supports Vermont's compact settlement areas. It's not seen any work by us. I'm not, maybe ACCD or someone else can report on any progress in this space, but it's not something that the subcommittees or council have advanced. And so I'm not sure what it would cost to actually do this. That's the same for the next one, which is hiring a consultant to engage stakeholders and support the development of a state land use plan that guides development to growth areas, town centers, and appropriate rural locations, and limits development within ecologically sensitive, risk-prone areas. Again, a recommendation in the CAP that carried up into the next steps for technical analyses, but not something that we've advanced or made any progress on to date. This is a study looking at the reductions in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, by investing in compact settlement. I'm hopeful that I'm not speaking out of turn, but originally we had hoped and anticipated that AOT would fund this, but that there would be an expectation that the budget for the climate office would provide matching funds. I understand and expect that AOT is able to fully fund this without match, but Andrea can speak to this after if I'm speaking out of turn. But my understanding from Andrea and others in AOT is that this is a priority in AOT for AOT's research dollars. The actual cost is more than 120,000. It's actually more closer to 150,000, and match is not needed from A&R to support this work, and that will carry forward from AOT without our support. Without our financial support, I should say. I have just a note here that there was a broad section in the Climate Action Plan around public engagement and what implementation looks like in that space. There are components of that work that we are not hitting based on the strategy that we reviewed and discussed with you earlier today. And so there's likely added capacity and financial support needed in that space if we were to fully realize all of the recommendations in the CAP. It's not something that we've currently been pursuing. And it sounds like perhaps the approach that we have taken feels satisfactory for now in this space. The last one, I'll just say, this was not a recommendation necessarily in the Climate Action Plan, but it has risen as a timely and important component for us to consider, which is in order to bring forward recommendations in the transportation space for you all as a council to consider. There's clearly going to need some work to be done in order for us to vet those policy recommendations. We are thinking about a budget around $125,000 for this work. That's based on some informed expectations based on the work we paid for with EFG and Cadmus and conversations we've had just with the Cadmus, even though that's not likely, we're not moving forward with a contract with Cadmus, but we did speak to their transportation expert to think about just the cost it would take to do something like we're envisioning. Megan O'Toole graciously worked to put together another U.S. Climate Alliance grant. There's a separate bucket specifically for transportation analyses. She applied for the maximum amount there, which was $100,000. We expect there to be 2 phases of that Climate Alliance funding. The first phase to advance the most imminent need, which is the advance some further understanding in the space for rulemaking around Advanced Clean Cars 2, and that would complement the analyses that we already have for Advanced Clean Trucks, so that as we move forward through the rulemaking process, we can stand up a robust technical analysis that justifies the need and expectation for those rules. And then whatever funding is left beyond that analyses would go to what we're calling phase 2 for transportation analyses, which would look at, once we have sort of a clear understanding of what business as usual gets us in the transportation space with Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks in space, what the necessary policy levers are that would help us close the gap between business as usual and where we need to be for our emissions reductions requirements for 2025 and 2030. So we're hopeful that if that grant materializes, that we would have roughly $70,000 or so in that grant to put towards phase 2. And then we would be thinking about with AOT closely about where we might be able to think about added capacity in that space. So those are the priorities as I understood it. Bronwyn's already identified one gap in this table. So look forward to hearing from others about things that I might have missed or misspoke about. So happy to leave this up for a minute, but I'll take it down as people start to talk and I see it's not needed.
Super. Okay. Thanks, Jane. Some hands went up when you were talking. Let's take those hands and then we'll figure out how we want to provide some thought about prioritization. Chris?
Yeah, Jane, can you scroll down just a wee bit to the those 2 cross-cutting issues? I'm a little concerned that we may have a structural issue in that with cross-cutting pathways, because they're cross-cutting, they're important because they do cross our programmatic or sectoral sectors. But at the same time, we don't really have those pathways don't necessarily have a ready-made advocacy group like a specific task might or a subcommittee might. So those 2 items are very important. I would certainly advocate for them being funded. And I would advocate for the council asking that they be funded. But I'm a little concerned that we don't necessarily have a means by which to advocate for that through our subcommittee process. So I just want to flag that.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Jared?
Thanks, David. I just want to start by saying that I think it's, this is a difficult question because I'll just, speaking for myself, think that all of this research and analysis is valuable and eventually will be necessary to help us revise the climate action plan, improve the climate action plan, and meet the responsibility with which we've been charged. But in the near term, recognizing that there are likely limited funds, in terms of how we go about prioritization, I just want to offer a thought and then my interpretation of that to help us start us off. And that is, I always, whenever there's a question related to this process, I always go back to the statute, to the Global Warming Solutions Act and what the legislature required of us. And, you look at, the Section 1, the short title, Section 2, legislative findings, those are fairly straightforward, but you start getting into the substance of what's required in Section 3 of 10 BSA 578. And I will state up front that, I am not a lawyer, but, the very first line of 578A says, greenhouse gas reduction requirements. Vermont shall reduce emissions of greenhouse gases from within the geographical boundaries of the state and those emissions outside the boundaries of the state that are caused by the use of energy in Vermont, as measured and inventoried pursuant to Section 582 of this title. I think it's incredibly problematic that we do not yet have a way to measure and assess the very first line of the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act with regard to those emissions outside the boundaries of the state and that are caused by the use of energy in Vermont. So I know I have one view of this, having been participating in the Science and Data Subcommittee, but in terms of the criteria of timeliness in the order of operations and what's required in the statute, I just want to say, from my perspective, this is, task 1A that I interpret to actually be required by the statute and not something that is just a question that we would like to have answered eventually, which I think some of the other areas of analysis do fall into, although I agree that they're all important. So I just want to raise that up to start with, that if in this situation of limited resources, I think the criteria of what the law requires needs to be elevated.
Okay, great, Jared. So yeah, we're going to need to think a little bit about that prioritization and how you as a council want to handle the fact that there are certainly more pieces on that list without a clear funding pathway than there are funds in the budget that Secretary Moore presented. Secretary Moore, your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer, sorry, caused a horrible echo, I suppose. I just wanted to offer a couple of thoughts in this space. One is this may be a great opportunity for Secretary Clouser just to provide a little bit of context about the budget process. It doesn't necessarily get at this year, but some of what will ultimately be unfunded needs that are currently shown on this page and how to get them further consideration. The other piece just wanted to flag for Jared and others in terms of timing is the clean heat standard also has a lot of language now around life cycle emissions, and we're just going to need to be really cognizant of that particular piece of legislation that's winding its way through the legislature as we speak. Assuming it come to pass, I think we're going to have to be real careful in coordinating and making sure that all of these different life cycle pieces speak to one another.
Okay, great. Secretary Clouser, do you want to talk a little bit about that? And so we're putting a pin in a second about prioritization for this round, but let's talk the bigger picture about the budgeting process and what this might mean for the council going forward as well.
Sure. So to be clear, this is just a suggestion that I think we're offering up to the council members for consideration, but and some additional background on the way the budgeting process works for the executive branch and agencies and departments within it, as well as the judicial branch and some other boards and commissions who submit their budget to the governor for consideration prior to proposing them for the legislature. So just really quickly, timeline wise, typically budget instructions go out from the Department of Finance and Management in early fall with a deadline for agencies and departments to return their proposed budgets to Finance and Management for review and discussion to be presented to the governor for an ultimate determination on what's in the governor's recommended budget for the next year. The deadline for that it varies by year, but it is typically around Halloween, towards the end of mid to end of October. And so I wanted to offer that timeline up to the council as a suggestion that if there is the ability for the council to kind of discuss and prioritize what technical analyses should be funded in the following year, if those discussions and decisions can take place prior to mid to late October, that would allow the council to then submit in a manner consistent with other agencies and departments and boards and commissions to a budget to the governor for ultimately potential inclusion. Obviously, there's no guarantees, but potential inclusion in the governor's recommended budget for the following year. And so that, that would at least in a timely manner give the council an understanding of what would be in the governor's recommend and what the members of the administration, who are also members of the council, could support going forward, and provide the council some time to plan for other strategies, or the remaining members of the council to plan for other strategies if those recommendations ultimately were included in the governor's recommend.
Got it. Right. I was really backing up that timeline so that you as a full council can have that conversation and dialogue with the administration members fully participating in it. And that's, if you back it up to that timeline, all of a sudden it becomes more workable. Great.
Right.
Okay. So that's a recommendation for this year to do that. Okay. Great. So just before we go back to the prioritization around the funding for this cycle right now, how do folks react to what Secretary Clouser is putting out there as the next time we do this, we should start in October so that we are influencing the governor's recommend and your full council can participate in that, including administration officials. Any thoughts on that? General, yep, that sounds great. Let's do it that way, or pushback on that, Joey?
No, it's not necessarily pushback, and I really appreciate the overview, Secretary Clouser. I guess one of my questions is, as Chris Campany noted, and I think we know that this is like a moment of unprecedented federal dollars coming in, so how we use those dollars and get ourselves in that hopper is really critical. I guess the question for either Secretary Clouser or Secretary Moore is, in the governor's recommend for the ARPA dollars, my understanding is that several of those dollars are anticipated to be spent over a 4.5-year timeline. So, different buckets of dollars you're going to support climate action plan priorities, but not necessarily expended in fiscal year 23, but is expended over a longer timeline. So my question is, if you can just sort of give people, more clarity around that, and then maybe sort of how you're thinking about, Secretary Clouser's recommendation related to coming back next year, like how the ARPA dollars fit into a broader conversation and a broader budgetary strategy within, the executive branch, and how we might fit into that. Because it seems like, I just think that's an important thing for people to be very cognizant of, like the timeline upon which those dollars are going to be expended and how far those dollars will get us in different programs.
Sure. So just as folks may recall, the state of Vermont received a little north of $1 billion of what is sometimes referred to as SFR funding that is generally and broadly available to support work responding to COVID. And we've called that the ARPA funds. The legislature and administration agreed on an initial expenditure in the FY22 budget of, I think, around $600 million worth of that money. An additional $85 million worth of that money is being allocated in the FY22 budget adjustment, which would leave a little more than $400 million on the table. The governor's FY23 budget proposes to allocate all of the remaining ARPA funds into the 5 broad buckets of work where these efforts have been concentrated over the last 2 years, which is climate action, water infrastructure, broadband, housing, and economic recovery and development. So you're right, Joey, in that the fund, that $161 million worth of ARPA funding would represent sort of the sum total of the ARPA fund, remaining ARPA funds that would come to climate action. ARPA dollars need to be committed to projects no later than December 31st of 2024. We sometimes use the word encumbered, but through a grant or contract or other mechanism committed to a project, those projects need to be complete by December 31st, 2026. So, you know, I sort of waver or move back and forth between feeling like we have a lot of time and, oh my goodness, how on earth are we going to get all of this work done between now and when those dollars would need to be returned to the US Treasury. So the part of the thinking in proposing the full allocation of the remaining $400-ish million in the 23 budget is to help partners that will be essential to doing this work on the ground plan for what's likely to take place over the next 3 to 4 years, both in terms of thinking about staffing, thinking about supply, and just thinking about order of operations and work they may need to do to get prepared. And the hope being by saying things like, we are committed to investing $80 million in weatherization, it helped folks understand the magnitude of that investment and start to do the work needed to scale appropriately. I would welcome if Kristen wants to jump in and correct anything I've said, just in the chance that I've botched it somewhere.
No, that was perfect, Julie.
Great. Okay. Chris, then Jared, and then we really need to think about what we're going to do. Or Chris, you dropped your hand. Go ahead.
Just one note about in the ARPA realm. The guidance for municipalities, we'll have more guidance through VLCT tomorrow about the actual financial reporting piece, but basically up until the first $10 million, which of course is well above what most of our municipalities are getting in ARPA funds, municipalities are going to be able to basically treat that ARPA funding as lost revenue, which means it'll be basically treated as any other general fund revenue, which means those restrictions that municipalities had before about having to spend it primarily on infrastructure type projects, especially like water and wastewater, which could help assist with compact settlement. That requirement now appears to be gone. And so they can pretty much spend it on what they want to spend it on. Again, we'll get more guidance late tomorrow afternoon from VLCT, but that looks to be the case. So just to the extent that anybody was assuming that the investments would naturally be going from municipalities in towards infrastructure, that's not likely not to be the case any longer.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris. Jared.
Thanks, David. I want to preface this by saying that I have nothing but admiration and appreciation for the skill and diligence that ANR has shown over the last year in kind of managing and facilitating the council and kind of stewarding the funds that we have available to us. But I do think it's important for us to pause and think not just about the timeline for coming up with budget requests, but also the process for decision-making as a council with regard to what we want to see funded as distinct from an ANR budget. And I don't know the exact kind of parallel or best analogy to use here. I can think of a couple of examples from previous experience when I was at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. I served on the Working Lands Enterprise Board. I still serve on the Clean Energy Development Fund. But in both of those situations, you had basically state funds going to an agency that was managing those programs, Agency of Natural Resources in the case of Working Lands Enterprise Board, Public Service Department in the case of the Clean Energy Development Fund. But in terms of the budget allocations, whether it was needed technical assistance or even kind of grant funding, which those two examples both do, and it's less relevant to the Climate Council, those funding allocations were voted on by those entities. So even though the funds were appropriated to the kind of managing agency, there are situations in which there may be differences of opinion between that agency and the board or council that is established. And so I just hope that we add to this conversation, not just the timeline for when we should get budget requests in, but how do we have a decision-making process that distinguishes between an A&R budget and a climate council budget. And hopefully the vast majority of the time there will be consensus and agreement about what the priorities are, but I don't think we can necessarily assume that.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Yeah, Bram?
So just following up, Secretary Moore had mentioned the $80 million for weatherization, which is the largest piece of that funding. But I was remembering that we had talked through the increased efficiencies that accrue when you combine weatherization with transforming the heat and cooling in a particular building or home. And the budget included upgrades to electrical service, but I just think as we work on allocating these funds and as we talk to the legislature and to the people in the administration working on allocation, that we keep in mind the kind of leverage that we get when we combine weatherization with conversion of heating and cooling.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Bram. And I wonder, Secretary Moore, someone who's been deeply involved in the budgeting process, is it contemplated to do those two things together in the way this is being envisioned right now?
It is, specifically when it comes to low-income Vermonters, that the weatherization, what falls under the bucket of weatherization at scale would be, in addition to direct weatherization, looking at some of those fuel switching opportunities. These programs need to be designed, but very much appreciating the efficiency point Bram is raising. When folks are in a space and doing work, I think it's important to look at all of those opportunities and believe that we have that flexibility with these dollars in designing a program that does as much as possible in service of the needs of low-income Vermonters.
Great. Okay. All right. So now we've got this tricky thing in front of us. Yeah, Bramson. Yep. Excellent. Okay. So at this moment in time, we have a predicted budget, unencumbered budget of, I believe it's $100,000. We've got a list of things from the climate action plan that clearly can add up to more than that. Some of which have alternate funding sources like the Climate Alliance grants, et cetera. So I was looking in the chat as we were going. Chris Campany was saying we need to increase the size of the budget overall, even as we try to give some signals around priorities for the existing budget. I wonder if counselors might make a suggestion here about specifically what you'd like to do. And I know if we go into this area of asking the legislature right now for more funding, that the administration members of this climate council are going to have to sort of recuse themselves because they're fully on board, committed with the governor's budget as presented. But I just wonder if someone wants to put out there, Jared's put out there an idea of prioritization. That's one piece of this. The other piece is if you as a council, particularly non-administration members of this council, do want to proactively go out and signal that you'd like to see additional funding coming in for some of these studies. So does someone want to put a suggestion out there about really what the signal is you want to give coming out of today's conversation? Leslie Ann?
Thanks, David. So I think one thing that might be helpful to me is to have all of these very overlapping but moving sources of funding together in one place. because I think that would help with some of the thinking that we are going to be doing around prioritization in terms of if there are existing pieces that we could be targeting either at the federal level or in other cases or foundational level, to have them all in the same place so that we don't feel like we have competing either needs, requests, or asks going on. Because from the last hour or so, we have a number of these multiple moving pieces. And as we've had the discussion, it's become clearer that some of these could be funded in other places, while others should be a request directly from the legislature. So just from, I guess, the way that I think it might be helpful if there was some sort of like giant piece of paper that had all of these dollar signs together so that we could then move forward saying, okay, this might go here, that might go there.
Okay. All right. Chris Campany?
Yeah, I mean, I really do wish that we could have just an objective conversation about what funding we need to fully execute everything that we're tasked by statute and by the cap to do, and then develop a budget that way rather than just rely on, respectfully what the governor has proposed. And we're at a bit of a disadvantage because it's based on conversations we had at steering committee. I totally understand and appreciate what the secretary said about the typical budgeting process, and that would be the way it should would happen in years going forward. But this year, it seems like we should be able to tell everybody, just have an objective conversation, tell the governor, tell the legislature, this is what this is going to cost, and based on our best assumptions, and that way we know. But I think we're a little hamstrung because I think state staff can't even necessarily support the council having that conversation. So it feels like that would wind up having to be, like almost a side project of the non-administration council members. So I've talked about this before at steering committee. I'm not trying to be provocative or anything. I'm just from a rational decision-making standpoint, it seems like we should be able to come up with that. I don't know if we need to ask permission of the governor to allow, his staff to be able to engage in such a conversation or what, but, I would love to just be able to just kind of take a rational decision-making approach to this and just come up with what it takes to do it.
Okay. I see the hand up in the room there. I don't know if that's who that's from.
It's me.
Okay, yep, go ahead.
I just want to flag that understanding what Chris is suggesting, the focus can't be solely on the funds needed to do the studies. I am very concerned that we're sort of the finite resources of the climate office are a thing. We have $1 million of studies that we're looking at in the coming fiscal year, and do not necessarily have the personnel to administer a wider range of studies. I mean, all of these things are obviously important. And as I think it was Jared said, likely at some point need to be completed. And I suspect that point is before the next update to the climate plan is due back to the legislature in 4 years. That said, I feel strongly we need to have a conversation, not just about magnitude, but about priorities and what is reasonable to bite off in a given year. We don't have enough staff to manage an unlimited number of contracts. In fact, talked to Jane a bit this morning about between the working groups and the existing contract management, the demands that are being placed on her time, which in turn then sort of limit the ability to move some of these other efforts and initiatives forward. And it's a really complex stew, and we need to be cognizant of that as we engage in these discussions.
Okay, so it's another factor, just the sheer capacity to manage the amount of work in a given year. Okay, Joey and then Chris.
Well, I'm sort of struggling because I feel like we're conflating two different things, and which is that what do we want to recommend in terms of like with the $100,000 ish to further study, and then what else do we need to do over the course of time? And to Secretary Clauser's point, how do we ready ourselves for the next, more proactively for the next budgetary conversation. I asked the question of Secretary Moore because I'm just trying to wrap my head around, this is a moment in time where there's unprecedented federal dollars. So we want to, make a case for, and I think the administration has made a good case for, and a significant investment in climate. And I'm very much appreciative of that. But I guess it seems to me like maybe we should separate the two things and tackle one and then the other, because one is time limited. I know that they are connected, but I'm sort of struggling with how, what we're focusing on in this moment. And yes, we need a lot of technical analyses, but in this moment, especially because even if the council did want to make another recommendation separate from what the administration has put out there, that conversation is happening right now in House Appropriations, and there's a lot of important things that they should be funding. So I'm just a little worried about the timing of what we're tackling here.
Right. Thanks, Joy. And let's pick up Chris, and then let's try to put some order to our conversations and wrap up what we're going to be able to do today. Chris?
Yes, as I noted in the chat, I wasn't talking about, just what studies need to be done. We've never had the whole conversation about what staff capacity is needed to do everything, including the studies. So, that's why I would argue, it's kind of like if you're thinking about what work do you want to do on your house or your office, you look at everything that you need to do, you develop a full budget, and then you begin to prioritize from there. What happened was we prioritized. We have really had that discussion about what the full costs are. We went with the assumptions about what was proposed in a budget, which is totally fine. It's nothing nefarious there, bad, no ill intent. That's just what happened. I'm arguing that, Julie's frankly helped make the point that we need to identify what the full administrative capacity needs to be, the operational capacity, where is it housed? That's being decided, but how much is it going to cost? And then we have the overall budget, then we can start prioritizing what needs to happen. So just wanted to clarify again, I think the value of having that conversation. It may not be possible to have it, but I just want to put that out there.
Thanks, Chris. Bronwyn?
Just one thing to maybe offer in terms of how to think about the prioritization that this conversation has made me think about as well is what of these are somehow interconnected in some way. So, Lauren brought up the point that, the first time we did an inventory, it wasn't necessarily comprehensive. It wasn't accounting for some sources of agriculture, either sequestration or emissions. And so I think about that in this prioritization as well. So I know I'm thinking about this from my agency's perspective, and I'm sure other folks can find examples of this in looking at this list of technical analyses. But just as an example, if we're going to develop a measuring progress tool, that tool is going to be based on what we've already measured. And if we haven't already measured, or if we haven't already analyzed vulnerability of commercial sector, then that's just not going to be included in the developing progress tool. And maybe that's okay, and that's a decision we make strategically, but I do you think it's helpful to think about what pieces of these are really tied? And if we move forward with one without doing other baselining work first, how useful is that tool to us? And when are we going to have to go back and redo that tool to account for additional sort of baselining work that we needed to do? So I know that I'm speaking from my agency's interest, but I'm just offering that up as a way to think about this list of tasks as well, and think about them in terms of what pieces for us are linked to another.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think there's kind of two decision points in front of us right now, and I'm also cognizant of the time today. One is, in a universe in which the budget that's out there that was presented by Secretary Moore ends up being what is available, you all as a council can give some signals about how to spend the funds that are available. In this case, it would be the roughly 100,000. So where you'd want that to go, given where you think other things will get funding from other sources, et cetera. So Jared made one recommendation around specifically what that should look like. Others could do that. The second decision point is, for right now, given that budgeting decisions are sort of in their final hurrah in the state legislature, do you, particularly the non-administration members of this council, want to send some signal to the legislature about additional funding that you'd like to see, right? Those seem like the two questions that you need to address right now. And then some of the bigger picture pieces, as Chris mentions, or others, about a process going forward, a more organized process. It feels like that is going to kick in for your process this year, and maybe not the process right now for March 2022. June, go ahead, please.
Just very briefly, I want to put on the record my sincere discomfort with the several allusions that have been made to the or better said, the administration members of the council. I just don't want it to go unremarked upon that this is a council that has 23 members, and the fact that at decisive moments that have to do either with decisions of policy that this council's making or funding decisions, resource decisions, we keep carving out the 8 administration members from the rest of the council. I think it illustrates the problematic nature of how this council has been constituted. And secondly, I want to put on the record that I think we are articulating mission creep on this meeting. Unlike the Clean Energy Development Fund, there is no fund that has been created with money deposited in it to be expended subject to the judgments of the fund board and the participation or input or whatever you want to call it of the commissioner. I have very quickly contrasted the Clean Energy Development Fund statute with the Global Warming Solutions Act, and I see no mechanism of this nature whatsoever in the Global Warming Solutions Act. What we have is an agency, ANR. It has staff. We have the department. It has staff. This council is entitled to technical and administrative support from state government, but it does not have a separate existence as an entity that gets a budget and that conducts its policy initiatives and its advocacy and the like. That's my view, at least, and I just want to put that on record.
Thanks, June. Okay. Right. So it's a bigger issue about the role of the council in budgeting going forward that June's putting out there. Okay. Okay. Interesting. I would be interested to test people's viewpoints in these different scenarios. One scenario being in the scenario in which the budget that ultimately gets approved this year looks like the one that was presented by Secretary Moore. Sorry about the noise in the background. And so I'd be interested to hear people's viewpoints about that scenario in which it is 100,000 left over. Hang on just 1 second so you don't have to listen to this. If folks were required in that scenario to put some priority on the table, would you put a similar set of priorities, for instance, of that one that's at the top of the list, which is the life cycle analysis piece, using, for instance, Jared's logic? Would that be something you'd gravitate to? Would you gravitate to something else if that were the scenario you were posed with, of this 100,000 being what is available in the state budget for studies? So that's one question I think to mull on. If we're not able to answer that today in the time we have, we may need to schedule something, and we can talk to Jane about this, if it makes sense to schedule something short to really finalize this question, if you want to be giving a signal to ANR about the use of those funds. Rich?
I'm answering your question. Yes, I would support the recommendation that Jared articulated, that we should if we just have that small amount of money available, we should try to focus it on the life cycle analysis, because I think it is directly connected to the major categories of emissions that we're trying to wrap our arms around in the short term, namely transportation and heating. And for that reason, that's why I would vote that we do that now. If we're unable to come to a decision on that, I would recommend that we, as a council, ask the steering committee, which does have representatives of all the committees on it. I'd ask the steering committee to make that judgment if it needs to be made before we could have our next meeting.
Great, thanks. And I saw Liz in the chat as well doing that. I feel like, given that scenario is a potential or likely scenario, right? That in which you have what is presented is what ultimately ends up being the budget. This would be a timely moment for you all to say, if that's a scenario, this is what I'd like to do. And so I'd even propose, if folks wanted to do a quick straw poll amongst yourselves to see if there is support for doing life cycle as that priority, if those are the funds that are available. Before I do that poll, if folks have a different view about, in that scenario, about what would be a priority, I welcome folks to share a different view if they have it, before we do a quick poll of council members to see where folks are at.
Just a clarifying question, David.
Yeah.
Is everyone clear on what the life cycle analysis is? I assume everybody is, but.
Would anybody like a little more explanation of it?
Sure,
This is something that was put out for a request for information, so there's some greater clarity emerging. But would anybody like that, a little more information right now? Or folks feeling comfortable enough with the information they have?
I admit that I have not read the RFI. My apologies. And I'm familiar with what a life cycle assessment is. I guess if there's a quick summary of what we anticipate the life cycle assessment will get us in terms of the point Jared made about being able to measure progress, I'd be curious about just the summary of what does the life cycle assessment get us in terms of measuring progress versus measuring additional sources of emissions. And obviously the two are linked, but I'm just, if there's a quick summary of that would be helpful.
Okay. I'd love sort of the 30-second version of that from someone who's been deeply involved in the work to answer Bronwyn's question. Whether it's Rich, Jane, Jared, anybody to answer Bronwyn's question.
It's a great question, and I would defer to Jared because he has been involved in the RFI.
Jane or others from A&R who've actually crafted it, feel free to speak up. But in the interest of time, I will just say that the RFI is constructed primarily to be able to answer this question of being able to assess the emissions that occur outside the boundaries of Vermont caused by the use of energy in Vermont. I think one of the first steps is kind of getting definitions and boundaries correct. What do we mean when we say upstream emissions versus life cycle emissions? But the intent is to be able to supplement our existing greenhouse gas emissions inventory with those emissions that occur outside of the boundaries of the state as a result of our energy use, so that we can feel confident and know that we as we reduce emissions from within our borders, we are also reducing emissions on net beyond our borders as a result of the choices here. So there's more there, but that is the primary intent, is to really start baselining and then being able to track over time those emissions that are not currently counted in our in-boundary inventory.
Perfect. Thanks, Jared. That's helpful. And Catherine, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. That was helpful to understand, because like Bronwyn, I haven't read the RFI either. and I'm sorry that I've been in and out of the meeting today with lots going on at home, but I would just say that I'm not feeling like I know enough to say, yes, this is what we should spend the remaining funds on. And perhaps it's because I still feel like we're missing a big comprehensive picture. And I continue to be concerned that the resilience side of the chart is woefully under-resourced. All of the recent studies show no matter what we do to reduce emissions, that mitigation, resilience is going to be key to everything. So I guess I'm not ready to say, yay, this is what we should do. So I'll just express that. And I think we need more work on the bigger picture of how it all fits together and more work on how we're going to resource the resilience side.
Okay. Can I just do a check here? From a timing standpoint, we're not scheduled to meet as a council again until May-ish. And I'm wondering from A&R standpoint, when do you need a signal from the council, or when would a signal from the council be most helpful in terms of understanding the use, how to dedicate funds?
So the dollars that are shown, that $100,000, it realistically isn't available to us until the next fiscal year, July 1st. That said, understanding the council's intentions sooner than that is important to the ability to start to work on an RFP. And that takes time both to develop substantively, because we know folks will want to have the opportunity for review and comment, but also just procedurally. And so, sooner than not is really important. I don't know that it has to be decided today, but I think we need some clear next steps that folks are agreeing to get to a decision point.
Got it. Okay. Folks, we're going to need to wrap up this conversation. We've really run up against the clock on this. Chris and then Joey, if we have some quick comments, and then let's find a pathway to wrap this up.
Yeah, because I appreciate Joey sharing that, because that makes me actually look at the language in statute since it was established in 2007. Almost makes me wonder, why tap the limited fundings of the that have been afforded to the council and doing the climate action plan when that was a requirement established in 2007. It seems like that's something that the legislature would want to fund potentially independent, so that we're not using our limited funds as they are to necessarily fund that. So just throwing that out there.
Okay. Joey?
I guess I would say, but that also means since it hasn't happened, it seems like really important to happen. And I guess I kind of wonder about, I would like to, this seems like a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions assessment that would inform like one of the core statutory obligation of the Global Warming Solutions Act in terms of the legal accountability seems really important. So I would love for us to fund it. Jane also noted that the funding, $100,000 is based on the RFI response, is not going to be enough. And I hear you, Catherine, when you say we probably need more time and not, but I do wonder if could we put some thoughts in writing and a potential draft letter to the legislature? Again, they are moving quickly. That would say we need a greenhouse gas life cycle emissions accounting, and it should be more broad and sort of lay it out on paper to urge a little bit more of a comprehensive investment. But I do fundamentally believe we need a foundation of information to complement the existing inventory. And that should be a really critical component, a priority.
Okay. All right. So here's my suggestion, because we're going to start to lose people in just a number of minutes. In terms of next steps on this, there were a number of you that felt strongly that it's time to give a signal as a council that among the list of priorities, that life cycle analysis feels to be rising to the top for a number of reasons. There are others that have asked for a little more time to think about it. Also, we've heard just now from Joey, it would be interesting to communicate to the legislature the importance of funding the suite of these things, because they do fit together. I don't know how you want to communicate that. If someone has an idea about the type of communication to give, perhaps you can delegate that communication to your steering committee to come up with it in a quicker way than having all of you together do it together. So I think those two things are the issues where you need to provide a little more guidance to ANR, both in terms of, are you ready to say yep to that prioritization of the life cycle analysis? And if you want to communicate something to the legislature, you need to do it fairly quickly. And you need to figure out how to do that via your steering committee or some other pathway. If someone wants to make a specific proposal there, I'm happy to, we can do a quick temperature check for everybody, particularly around that communication to the legislature. I haven't heard a specific proposal of what that might look like. Does anyone want to make a specific proposal about that? Okay. So it seems to me that we have unfortunately run out of time and we're losing folks rapidly, and we really haven't settled on a set of next steps on this. I wonder if you all are open for a short meeting where we'll have the all of you back here to make a specific set of next steps, both on the prioritization in an as-if scenario for the 100,000 and any kind of communication you'd like to do right away up to the council, excuse me, up to the legislature. So Jane, I don't know if that's possible to do to gather folks back because we're seeing a lot of folks with a hard stop at 2.
I think we're going to have to talk about this offline. Because one, I don't think there's quorum anymore. And 2, I just want to be respectful that I've heard loud and clear from most counselors that you want less meetings.
Yeah.
And just want to be mindful of, like, our intent was not to meet again until May. And so just want to check in. A short meeting is not an administrative challenge to set up, but there's not a quorum here to decide that. We'll have to think about how to proceed.
Yeah. I think we may still have 12, 13 folks. So I think we actually do have a quorum. So in terms of next steps, before we do lose everybody, I think the key next step for folks is for you as a council to say, yes, let's have a short meeting and make some very specific decisions about this and make it short, and we can organize ourselves to have those decisions points. Or delegate this to your steering committee, and note the steering committee will take up the conversation as it was presented today and help make some decisions. So I would encourage everybody who's a council member right now to drop in the chat if you would prefer to have a short meeting to make some decisions on this in the short term, or whether you'd prefer to delegate this to your steering committee so that they can take up these issues and make some decisions in your name. Rich, while folks are doing that, I really encourage you to use the chat so we can get a sense of everybody here about what your preference would be in terms of a short next steps meeting or delegate to your steering committee. Rich?
Oh, I was just going to suggest what you just did, which was ask us to choose between those 2 options. And for me, I would, as I said earlier, be willing to just let the steering committee discuss this and decide what to recommend for the 100,000. There are a lot of other issues, bigger issues beyond that, but for the 100,000, the steering committee can do it as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, I'm not seeing recommendations in the chat except for either option. Great. So my suggestion here is let's defer unless are folks comfortable deferring to the steering committee a recommendation around that 100,000. And also the steering committee may decide to transmit some message up to the legislature. Does anybody have a concern with deferring to the steering committee on that? Okay. So
I want to flag that I am concerned by that, but I'll clearly be in the minority about that, as I am often in the minority about all else. So I'll note it for the record and move on with the will of the group.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks for noting it. Okay. Okay, so I believe that's the next steps for this piece. And I apologize that I wasn't a little more organized today to help do this in a more timely fashion. There's a few other pieces before we sign off that were on the agenda, some of which we can probably skip. We don't need a legislative update. I think that could be done over email perfectly well, unless Jane, you'd like to correct me on that. There is a work plan, the slide that's connected to your agenda that just lists the upcoming meetings as we see it of the council. And that is a helpful thing to look at. I recommend you all take a peek at that. I can share it on the screen right now, or Marion or Jane can.
Do you want me to share? It's in the chat. So, oh, there you go.
I got it. It's in the chat, and here it is, where we have specific things that you all need to work with on meetings in May and June, with an idea that in the fall that there'll be significant more work to finalize the biomass and transportation recommendations and do the kind of budgeting process that would feel better than what this year has been.
Just so you know, this envisions what I had hoped to talk about, which we can talk about at a steering committee meeting or another upcoming meeting, is we'll take the summer off as a council.
Okay, great. Okay. And then I want to make some time for any public comment that we might have today. And so let's just do a quick pause and see if anybody who is still with us, who's been observing our meeting today, would like to make a comment about our work. So if you are with us today and you'd like to make a comment, feel free to raise your hand or use the chat. And we're a small enough group that you can also just open up your mic if you're having a hard time finding the hand raise. Okay, great. Okay. I want to just, before we close up, I see there's been some pieces in the chat, Leslie Ann and Rich and others talking about the procedures needed to support its role as a standing body. I wonder if we want to pick that up in our next council meeting with something coming out of the steering committee about that frustration. Anything else before we finish up today?
David, I'm wondering if we might, for at least one of the committee meetings moving, like council meetings moving forward, if we might sort of tweak the agenda a little bit to have a sort of discussion space, that we can have either some questions, some prompting questions ahead of time, because it seems that there are a lot of these really sticky issues that have come up, but we don't really have a time and space sort of carved out to talk about them. And so maybe if we just sort of teed that up so folks could come ready to share some of that and talk through some of that, so we get to that place where, you know, we don't end up at the very end of a meeting having to try and make a decision that's really weighty for some folks. Because I know for me, I take a little bit longer to process and work through stuff and then voice that. And I think there may be some council members who are in that same situation. So if we just sort of carve out that place to sort of hold space and to let's actually talk and talk with each other, might be one way to help us move forward.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I love that, particularly as we get more periodic in the council meetings, is to prep folks up and make good use. And I think today was a little frustrating that we got to the very end and trying to make a decision that we didn't feel really comfortable making. Okay. Okay. Anything else, folks? Great. Okay. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. And we will take up the next steps with the steering committee, and appreciate everybody's time. All the best, stay safe, and we'll see you next meeting. Take care, everybody.
Stay on for a minute.